The photograph was old, faded, tucked behind the grease-covered grill where no one would notice. Until it fell. And when Marine Corporal Jackson picked it up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The quiet cook who'd been serving him breakfast for months, standing in full Marine dress blues, surrounded by his company in Fallujah, 2004. Welcome to Everyday Legends. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel, because sometimes the greatest heroes work in the most ordinary places. Mel's Diner sat on Highway 76, just 15 minutes from Camp Pendleton. From the outside, it looked like every other roadside diner, faded neon sign, cracked parking lot, windows that had seen better decades. Nothing special. But walk inside, and something was different. The food was perfect. Eddie Ramirez had been working here for 15 years, 5'6", stocky build, calloused hands that moved with surprising grace, 58 years old, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. Every morning at 4:45, Eddie's beat-up Ford pickup would pull into the employee spot. By 5 a.m., the grill was hot, coffee brewing, vegetables prepped. By 5:30, when Mel's opened, Eddie had already been working for 45 minutes. The customers loved him. Not because he was chatty. Eddie wasn't much for conversation. But there was something about him that commanded respect. Maybe it was his posture, back always straight. Maybe it was how he never forgot an order, never served a bad meal, never lost his temper even during the breakfast rush. "Morning, Eddie," customers would say. He'd nod and ask, "The usual," because Eddie remembered everyone. Truck driver Bill, 2 eggs over easy, bacon, hash browns. Police officer Santos, spinach omelet, wheat toast, orange juice. And Marine Corporal David Jackson, cheese omelet, hash browns, sourdough toast. What people didn't know about Eddie could fill a book. He lived alone in a small apartment, never married, no kids, no family anyone knew of. His apartment was sparse, just the basics and a few books on military history. There were signs if you knew what to look for. The way Eddie organized his workspace with military precision, how he moved efficiently around the kitchen, no wasted motions. And there were moments when the mask slipped, like when 2 Marines argued about combat tactics. Eddie looked up from the grill with such intensity that both went silent. That wasn't curiosity. That was the look of someone who'd actually done what they were only talking about. Or when a car backfired outside. Eddie dropped behind the counter before realizing what happened. He got up embarrassed, but for a moment his instincts had revealed themselves. Marine Corporal Jackson had been coming to Eddie's diner for 3 months. Fresh out of training, first assignment, he'd discovered Mel's by accident and became a regular because the food was incredible. Jackson was different from other young Marines. Quieter, more observant. He'd started noticing things about Eddie, the way the cook's eyes constantly scanned the dining room, how he kept his back to walls when possible, the respectful way Eddie treated every Marine, regardless of rank. "Thank you for your service," Eddie would say quietly when Marines left. Not loud, not making a show, just simple acknowledgement. Jackson had wondered about Eddie's story but never asked. In the Marines, you learn to respect privacy. That Tuesday morning started normally. Jackson finished his PT run early and grabbed breakfast before duty. The diner was quiet, just a few truckers and 1 other Marine. "Morning, Eddie," Jackson said, taking his usual counter seat. Eddie looked up from cleaning the grill. "Morning, Corporal. The usual?" "You bet. Extra bacon today. Long day ahead." Eddie began preparing the omelet. Jackson watched him work, appreciating the efficiency, the way Eddie managed multiple orders without breaking a sweat. The coffee machine started making that gurgling sound it made when it needed cleaning. Eddie sighed, set down his spatula, and moved to the machine surrounded by old photographs from the diner's 30-year history. As Eddie cleaned the machine, reaching behind it, something fell. A small photograph in a plastic frame, tucked so far back it must have been there for years. "Hey, Eddie, something fell," Jackson called out. "Could you grab it?" Eddie replied, voice muffled. "Probably just one of those old pictures." Jackson walked behind the counter, something customers normally wouldn't do, but he and Eddie had developed a rapport. He picked up the fallen photograph and froze. The image was unmistakably military, dated 2004. A group of Marines in full combat gear, standing in an Iraqi street scene. Desert camouflage, body armor, weapons, the 1,000-yard stare of a war zone. But it was the man in the center that made Jackson's blood turn cold. Standing front and center, wearing a Marine colonel's uniform, was Eddie. Younger, fitter, but unmistakably Eddie. This wasn't the quiet cook Jackson knew. This was a military commander, radiating authority and confidence. Jackson flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Fallujah, Iraq, November 2004, Colonel Eduardo Eddie Ramirez commanding. Colonel. Eddie was a colonel. "Find it?" Eddie called. Jackson looked up. Eddie was still working, oblivious. For a moment, Jackson considered putting the photo back, pretending he'd never seen it, but he couldn't. "Eddie," Jackson said, voice barely a whisper. Something in his tone alerted Eddie. He turned around and saw Jackson holding the photograph. Eddie's face went white. "Where did you get that?" Jackson held up the photograph. "It fell from behind the coffee machine." Eddie moved quickly, reaching for it, but Jackson didn't hand it over immediately. "Eddie, this is you, isn't it?" Eddie's jaw clenched. "Give me the picture, Corporal." "You were a colonel." "Jackson, you commanded Marines in Fallujah." Eddie finally took the photograph, tucked it into his apron pocket without looking at it. "That was a long time ago," Eddie said. "How long? 15 years? Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Eddie turned back to the grill, where Jackson's omelet was starting to burn. He flipped it quickly. "Because it doesn't matter. That life is over." "Doesn't matter?" Jackson couldn't hide his disbelief. "Eddie, you're a war hero." Eddie's hands stilled. "I'm not a hero, Jackson. I'm just a cook." "But you commanded Marines. You served in combat." "Yes, I did. And now I cook eggs. Eat your breakfast before it gets cold." Jackson sat back down but couldn't eat. His mind was spinning. How does a Marine colonel end up cooking in a roadside diner? "Eddie, can I ask what happened?" Eddie poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter. For a long moment, he stared into his cup. "What happened is war, Jackson. War happened." The bell chimed as 2 truckers entered. Eddie straightened up, slipped back into his professional demeanor. "Meet me after my shift. 3 o'clock, behind the diner." At 3:15, Jackson found Eddie sitting on the back steps, still in his apron, smoking a cigarette. "Didn't know you smoked," Jackson said, sitting beside him. "Only when I'm stressed. Haven't had one in 6 months." They sat in silence. Then Eddie began to talk. "I grew up here. Parents came from Mexico, worked hard to give me opportunities. I was a good kid, good grades. Could have gone to college." "Why didn't you?" "Because in 1983, I watched the news about the barracks bombing in Beirut. 241 American service members killed, most of them Marines." Eddie took a long drag. "Something about that hit me hard. Young men, barely older than me, who'd volunteered to serve, and they died in their sleep. I decided that day I wanted to be a Marine." "So you enlisted?" "Shipped out to Paris Island 3 weeks after graduation. Loved every minute. The discipline, the brotherhood, the purpose. I was good at it. Leadership came naturally. Advanced quickly." Eddie flicked ash into a container. 20 years later, I was a lieutenant colonel. Then Iraq happened. I was selected to command Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Best Marines I ever served with. What was the mission? Security operations around Fallujah, but things escalated. By 2004, Fallujah was a war zone. Urban combat, house-to-house fighting. Hell. Jackson waited. He could see Eddie working up to something difficult. November 15th, 2004. Routine patrol. 32 Marines under my command. Good men, Jackson. Most younger than you. Eddie's voice began to strain. Intelligence said the sector was clear. We'd patrolled it dozens of times, but intelligence was wrong. What happened? Coordinated ambush, IEDs, RPGs, sniper fire from multiple positions. They'd been planning it for weeks, and we walked right into it. Eddie stubbed out his cigarette hard. I was at command post, maintaining radio contact. I could hear everything. Explosions, gunfire, my Marines calling for help for 45 minutes. Why couldn't you help them? Eddie's face hardened. Because I had orders. Wait for backup. Don't commit forces without air support. Standard procedure. But you could have gone anyway? Yes, I had vehicles, men ready to move. But my orders were clear. You don't abandon protocol because you're emotional. Jackson could see the pain in Eddie's eyes. So you waited. I waited. And while I waited, listening to my Marines die over the radio, I lost 17 men, 17 young Marines who trusted me to bring them home. The weight settled between them. Jackson tried to imagine listening to your soldiers dying while following orders that kept you from helping. Eddie, that wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? I was their commander. Their safety was my responsibility. When they needed me most, I chose orders over instincts. You followed proper procedure. Proper procedure got 17 Marines killed. Jackson didn't know what to say. What happened after? Investigation, official inquiry. They determined I'd acted appropriately. No disciplinary action. But the families of those 17 Marines, some blamed me. And honestly, I didn't blame them. So you left the military. Took 2 years. I tried to stay, tried to convince myself I could still command. But every time I looked at young Marines, all I saw were the faces of the men I'd lost. I couldn't trust myself anymore. And you came here. Bounced around first, different jobs, different cities, but I kept coming back. These people didn't know who I was or what I'd done. They just knew I could cook and showed up on time. Why cooking? Eddie smiled slightly. Learned to cook in the Marines. Used to help in the mess hall as a young lance corporal. Found it relaxing. When I got here, Mel needed a cook. Seemed like fate. Don't you think it's time to forgive yourself? For getting 17 Marines killed? For following orders? For being human? For making an impossible decision? Eddie shook his head. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can serve. Different way. But I can still serve. What do you mean? Every morning, Marines come through that door. Young men and women preparing to go places I've been. For a few minutes, I can take care of them. Make sure they get a good meal. Show them respect. Jackson began to understand. The cooking isn't just a job. It's the only way I know to still be useful. Still serve my country, even without the uniform. The photograph. Why keep it? Eddie pulled out the picture, stared at it. Because I never want to forget their faces. These men trusted me, and I failed them. But they deserve to be remembered. Over the following weeks, Jackson saw Eddie differently. He noticed the small ways Eddie took care of Marines, always keeping coffee cups full, slipping extra food onto plates, quietly comping meals for Marines struggling financially. One morning, a young Marine came in looking terrible, hungover, disheveled, clearly struggling. He ordered coffee and toast, sat alone. Jackson watched Eddie prepare the order, but instead of toast, Eddie made a full breakfast and carried it to the Marine's table himself. On the house, Eddie said quietly, drink some orange juice. You'll feel better. The Marine looked surprised. I didn't order this. I know, but you need it. I can't pay. I said it's on the house. Eat. Later, Jackson approached Eddie. That was good, what you did, Eddie shrugged. Kid was hurting. We've all been there. How did you know? You learn to read people when their lives depend on your decisions. Jackson realized Eddie's leadership skills hadn't disappeared. He'd redirected them. Eddie, do you think those Marines who died would want you punishing yourself forever? Eddie considered this. I don't know. I think they'd want you to keep being the man they trusted, the man who cared enough to carry their photograph for 15 years. And what man is that? A leader, someone who puts others' needs first. A few days later, Master Sergeant Williams walked into the diner. Jackson recognized him from base, a career Marine with multiple deployments. "I'm looking for Eduardo Ramirez," Williams said. Eddie looked up, recognition flashing across his face. "Williams?" "Hello, Colonel." The two men stared at each other. Jackson felt the weight of shared history. "It's just Eddie now," Eddie said quietly. "Not to me, sir." Williams walked around the counter and they embraced, both fighting tears. "I've been looking for you for 3 years," Williams said. "Why?" "To thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For keeping me alive, for training me, for teaching me what it means to be a Marine." "Williams, I should be apologizing. I failed you." Williams shook his head firmly. "No, sir. You gave us the tools to survive, the discipline, the training, the leadership principles. That's why I'm standing here." "But the ambush was war, Colonel. You taught us war's unpredictable. But you also taught us how to fight, how to think under pressure, how to take care of each other." Williams pulled out a folded paper. "I've stayed in touch with the other survivors, all 15 of us. We've all had successful careers, good lives, and we agree we owe that to the foundation you gave us." Eddie's hands shook as he took the letter signed by all surviving Charlie Company members. "Colonel Ramirez, we want you to know that your leadership saved our lives, not just in combat, but in everything after. You taught us honor, courage, and commitment. We are better men because of your example." Eddie's voice broke reading it. "Sir, we know what happened weighs on you, but you need to understand, in war, good people die. It's not fair, but it's reality. The best way to honor their memory is to keep living like the man they believed in." Jackson watched 15 years of guilt begin to crack. Over the next weeks, other Charlie Company survivors made pilgrimages to Mel's Diner. Each brought the same message: "Thank you." The change in Eddie was gradual but noticeable. He stood straighter, smiled more, and began to see his work not as penance, but as continuation of service. "You know what I've learned?" Eddie said to Jackson one morning. "What?" "Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about caring enough to keep trying, even after you've failed. And service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form." 6 months later, the local newspaper wanted to do a story. Eddie initially refused, but Jackson convinced him. The small article sparked something. Veterans from all over began coming to Mel's Diner. Word spread that there was a place where veterans were understood, respected, welcomed. Eddie became an unofficial counselor for veterans struggling with guilt and transition. His kitchen became a safe space where warriors could talk about things they couldn't discuss elsewhere. "Survivor's guilt never fully goes away," Eddie would tell them, "but you can transform it, turn it into purpose, into service, into something that honors those you've lost." 2 years after the photograph fell, Eddie's health began declining. Arthritis made cooking difficult, but he refused to slow down. "This is my post," he told Jackson. "I don't abandon my post." Jackson and other Marines organized to help Eddie. They'd arrive early for prep, stay late to clean. The diner had become their mission. One morning, Eddie collapsed behind the grill. Heart attack. As paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed Jackson's hand. "The diner, don't let it close. These Marines need this place." "We won't let that happen, Colonel." Eddie spent 3 weeks in the hospital. During that time, Marines took turns running Mel's Diner. The food wasn't as good, but they kept it open. When Eddie returned, he found the walls covered with photographs, letters, and tributes from Marines and veterans. Stories of how Eddie had helped them, inspired them, given them direction. One letter read, "Colonel Ramirez, you saved my life. Not in combat, but afterwards. When I was drowning in guilt, you showed me how to swim again." Eddie stood in his diner, surrounded by evidence of a different kind of victory, not measured in enemy casualties, but in lives touched, souls healed, purposes rediscovered. "You know something, Jackson," Eddie said, tears in his eyes. "Maybe I didn't fail those boys in Fallujah. Maybe I prepared them for something bigger, and maybe losing them prepared me for this." Jackson nodded. "You've been leading all along, Colonel. Just differently. Eddie worked until he was 75. When he retired, Marines threw him a ceremony. Charlie Company survivors flew in from across the country, along with dozens of veterans whose lives Eddie had touched. Williams gave the speech. Colonel Eduardo Ramirez taught us that service never ends. It just changes form. He showed us that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, not with force, but with food, not with commands, but with compassion. Eddie's legacy lived on. The diner became a non-profit, Eddie's Place, where warriors gather. It continued serving both food and hope. Above the grill, they hung 2 photographs. The original, Eddie in Colonel's uniform with Charlie Company in Fallujah. Next to it, Eddie in his apron, surrounded by hundreds of Marines he'd served at the diner. 2 uniforms, 2 forms of service, 1 warrior's heart. Eddie Ramirez proved that heroism isn't just about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about the quiet strength to get up every morning and serve others, even when your own heart is broken. It's about transforming pain into purpose, guilt into grace, loss into love.